Hi, I'm Nathan, and you're listening to the Queer Conscious Podcast. Okay, I know it's been a minute since I've gotten an episode out, and honestly, my recording equipment's been acting up. I finally got a good fix, and with everything else going on in the world, it's just been a little frustrating. But funny enough, that's exactly what today's episode is about. It's about how sometimes, no matter how you try, your equipment just doesn't quite seem to work. So you might see where I'm going with this. Performance anxiety is no joke. It can show up in so many different ways depending on your gender, your background, your education. And it's not just a later in life thing. It affects a broad range of ages. So whether it's nerves, pressure, or a total mental spiral, it can turn what's supposed to be a beautiful, intimate moment into something that a lot of people get anxious about and want to avoid. And for the LGBTQ plus community, the lack of comprehensive sex education only makes things harder. Or, not. And that's why today we're talking with the wonderful Dr. Jennifer Litner, certified sex therapist and sex educator. We're going to talk about what's really going on when the mind and body aren't on the same page. You'll learn why performance anxiety happens and simple strategies on how to feel more connected, more present, and more in control of your own pleasure. So if you're ready to invite intimacy without all that pressure, keep listening. This episode might just do it for you. Hi, Jennifer. Welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm good. I'm really excited for today's conversation. And I think a great introduction, I'd love for you just to tell us a little bit about your background and your practice and maybe what got you into this field.
Yeah. So I'm a sexologist by training, which means I study and teach and practice clinically in the field of sexuality. And I got into this field well over a decade ago now. And I was doing a lot of peer health education work and using a lot of condom demonstrations and teaching people how to use safer sex skills, things like that. And we also did some HIV testing, and I was a tester during that time. And I realized that so many people that were coming in were looking for way more than just the education around safer sex. They were having a lot of anxiety and distress about their relationships. And these were things that I wasn't a therapist at the time to counsel them on, but it was something that I saw that was really important. And I connected with a couple people in the field, and they basically, introduced me to the field of sex therapy. And it kind of felt like a great mold because I was already studying to be a psychotherapist. And this sort of, it turns out it was a lot of schooling and a lot of practice. And here I am. But I think the message I always tell myself and others is that sexuality is so much more than what we do with our bodies.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. And I remember going to those demonstrations in college and, in high school, you put the condom on the banana and stuff. And I'm like, that's great and all, but that's like the easiest thing. Like what I really need help with is, how do I prepare? How do I deal with the anxiety? How do I deal with the shame or the guilt that comes up around it? So I think it's a really big need. What need do you see specifically for the LGBTQ community being in this field?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the biggest challenges that I've noticed is not just that we don't get great comprehensive sex education in most places and the implementation is low, but that it's often not inclusive and queer focused. So a lot of times as a queer person, you don't see yourself represented there, right? If you're learning about dating and the only people that, they talk about in healthy relationships are men dating women. Well, if you're a woman dating a woman or man dating a man or you're non-binary or trans, where do you find yourself in all of this? And that can feel really hard. So I think we definitely need more inclusivity in our sexuality education and, also making sure that the providers that you're working with, right? A lot of times I see people for outpatient therapy and I'm very clearly queer affirming and celebratory in my practice, but there are a lot of providers who don't have a lot of experience in that area. So I think making sure that we have good inclusivity in the education we're learning, but also in the services healthcare wise that we are able to attain.
Yeah. And I know having a queer therapist changed my whole experience with therapy.
Yeah.
And so I imagine you get a lot of gratitude. What are some things that people thank you for, that's different than their typical straight therapist that they've experienced?
Well, I think that a lot of people are just like grateful to have a space to talk about things and not feel a sense of judgment, right? Like this is something that's kind of more common across like I would say all people, but definitely within, the more insular you are with your identities, right? The less we sometimes feel comfortable talking about them, or we're more selective about who we talk about them with, and some of the not necessarily the identities themselves, but sometimes the concerns we're having. A lot of my clients, I used to teach this course around for at a university level, and one of the things that we would always talk about is how people like will come to therapy and they're going to think the worry is that they're coming in, to talk about anxiety, but the therapist is going to think, oh, it's because you're queer or because you're kinky or because you're, interested in BDSM. Like, it's like there's this kind of problem that people have where we are taught in the field to be like over pathologizing. And I think that is something that a lot of people have fears about. So I often have clients just be like, hey, thanks for like recognizing that this isn't like part of the problem. It's part of me and who I am, but like my problem is my anxiety. And that sort of like feels like it's a low bar. Like I think we should be like all doing that, but that's just my opinion.
No, and I'm so glad you brought that up because you brought me back now into my first therapy session where I was like afraid to talk about things because I thought it was because I was queer I was having those issues, right? And so I would blame myself, and there's so much shame to even talk about it. And I'm like, this is my therapy session. What am I doing? And so you also talk about the anxiety that people face, and so one of the things we're going to talk about today is performance anxiety. What is that? How would you define performance anxiety?
So performance anxiety is this idea that you feel a level of distress or like you're monitoring how you're showing up in a current moment, usually during a specific task or event. So let's say if I am Simone Biles and I'm about to perform a gymnastics routine, right? I might have performance anxiety about how I'm going to be experienced when I, land my on the vault or the flip or whatever I'm about to do. And excuse me, gymnastics is not my forte. Sexuality is. So if Simone Biles is listening, please correct me here. I'm open to feedback. Um, but as far as like sexual performance anxiety, it's this idea that like you're going into an encounter and your anxiety or distress is about how that's going to be perceived by your partner, how you might be monitoring your body, right? The criticism or internal dialogue you may have about your own functioning, what's going to happen, is it going to happen the way you want it to? So performance anxiety is not a new phenomenon. It's something that applies to a lot of different things anytime we're in a performative role. But when it comes to sex, it's often about our bodies and like how we're going to be experienced by others and also how we're experiencing them.
Yeah, and gay and queer people definitely don't experience that, right?
Never.
So I'm curious though, how does it show up differently between people,
Yeah.
trans people?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I find that like with a lot of queer folks, there's a lot of worry about like showing up and being queer enough, right? When we get into that is like sort of like this general performance anxiety, like am I gonna like am I gay enough? Am I queer enough? Am I trans enough in a way? So sometimes that kind of thing can come up and make it feel like somebody's monitoring their body or their way that they're interacting. Like there's a lot of pressure around that. I think for the straight folks I work with, it's often more about like, did I get an erection? Did I last long enough? Right? Is my partner satisfied? Some of those things I think are common across the board, but there's a sort of like notion around gender scripting that I think comes up a lot too, around like, if you were raised to be masculine and with masculinity, you might have been taught the script that you need to be like turned on and ready to go immediately. And that's just not accurate for most people. If you were, socialized in the feminine, you might have been raised like not to acknowledge your sexual interest or arousal at all. So some of these things I think create challenges around intimacy and sex of like, okay, I shouldn't focus on this. Should I focus on this? What am I supposed to do? And it could be a lot of like mental gymnastics going to gymnastics again.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, mental gymnastics. Simone Biles, I
Yeah.
hope she's listening to this.
Yeah. Please do.
But that's so interesting. So people who are raised as women or in femininity, they're not really conditioned to acknowledge their pleasure or arousal.
It's a common frame I hear from a lot of people I work with.
Yeah.
It's not the only script. I think the other one is I need to please my partner. So especially with, um, this is a very heteronormative view, but I think a lot of queer people also experience this because we're kind of re-scripting art, right, in a way when doing things differently. And one of the scripts is I have to show up and be a good partner I have to show up and have good sex for my partner. Again, this is all kind of patriarchal in the way that this comes from, but it is, I think it creates this performance-based narrative of like, I'm monitoring my body so that I can have the right kind of sex to please my partner. And that can actually transcend, like, I think all relationships. I think most people want their partner to feel a sense of pleasure and they want that for themselves. So sometimes it could just be, I have anxiety more generally and I'm nervous because this relationship is new, or I don't feel super secure with this person. And I'm just really unsure how this sexual encounter is going to go. Or I feel like I've really put a lot of pressure on myself because I really want it to go well. And I don't really have a framework or anything that's like reassuring me that it will or will not. So sometimes that can show up too.
Yeah. And I imagine if you are so focused on your partner, that really stops your ability to be present with the pleasure you're experiencing.
It definitely can. Yeah, it's like a balance, right? Like we want to focus on ourselves and our own bodies so we can, attend to the sensations we're feeling. But if we're overly focused on it to the point where that's all we're thinking about and we're thinking about what's going to happen next, then that can create some distress for people.
And then you also mentioned this idea of being queer enough. How do your clients describe being queer enough?
Yeah. I think a lot of times it's like feeling secure in your body or in your own skin and being like, hey, am I like doing this the right way? Or like, is it okay if we're topping or bottoming? Or what if I don't like topping and I'm supposed to? Or what if like scissoring isn't for me? Or I don't really feel like, I like the idea of like penetrative sex, but I'm not with a person who has a phallus. Like, then what do I do? Like these kinds of things that I think it's like if I don't, a lot of people feel like they don't fit the script because they've had to create their own scripts. And so it creates sometimes confusion, I think, and pressure around that. Or if the representation you have doesn't feel like you fit with that, then that can also be challenging. So there's it's like very personal, I think, to the individual and definitely varies, but those are some of the ways I've seen it come up.
And it's interesting how you refer to these as the different scripts. I like that word. Where do these scripts originate from?
So script or sexual script is something that we use in the human sexuality field to kind of refer to the messages and the things we've learned about sex and sexuality. And as I think of it, when people are born, it's not that we come out of the womb feeling the way that we do about our bodies and about sexuality. We learn these things over time. And they often are shaped by a number of factors. So social community, peers, academics, right? What did you learn in school or not learn? What does your family of origin teach you or not teach you about this? What kind of media did you consume around this? So, now people are growing up with social media often, like it's integrated. A lot of this Generation Alpha, right, is having it's a much more like accessible and kind of in your face kind of experience than like folks who grew up in like the 80s and 90s and 70s. It's like where we were like watching a commercial or like you maybe saw this in books or heard about it, things like that. So I think media is another influence, TVs, movies, things like that.
And what are the messages that they're getting from that media?
Yeah. Again, it varies. Like, what are you consuming, right? So if you're watching a lot of like rom-coms, right, then you might learn that you might feel like sex is supposed to be like pleasurable and people are gonna like come at the same time and everyone's gonna have like this perfect experience and like you're not gonna hear anything weird that happens like Nobody has like a back that they threw out or like a spill that happened or any like awkward noises because they don't show that part, right? The rom-coms are like usually end with a wedding or a kiss or something cute and like historically. I think
Yeah. So
now we're
no,
getting
stop watching rom-coms. That's what I'm hearing. Kidding.
well, it's not stop watching rom-coms, but it's just like be an educated consumer of whatever media you're consuming. I think some rom-coms nowadays, I think, are doing a better job of showing some of these things. I've seen better representation in some of the even like Netflix shows and things like that. If you're a reality TV person, if you're somebody who watches, a lot of dramas, or if you're somebody who watches like sci-fi stuff, like I think every media outlet has its like different way of portraying it. But what I would say is, what are they wanting you to feel? Who's in charge of like who created this and what is it that they're trying to portray? And how accurate is that based on what you know? And if you're not sure, like, okay, I would do some digging around. Like a lot of this is online. We have research and you can always listen to this podcast and find out.
Yeah. Well, this is one of those podcasts, right? So
Yeah, this is one of those podcasts.
I love that.
Yeah.
No, but I love that being an educated consumer and being like, how realistic is this? Who's in charge of this? Who's making this? Because, obviously if it's created from the male gaze, right, we're going to be seeing something completely different than if it's a woman creating it or a queer person creating it. So I think that's really important to understand. And you also mentioned that family systems really play a role in the scripting that we grow up with. So what are some examples that you've seen of that?
Absolutely. So, everything from how you like were taught, if your parents or family ever talked about sexuality, or if they didn't, that usually sends a big message. For the things that people don't discuss, typically that is something that's more taboo, or maybe there's shame involved, or one of the ways that we actually learn shame is by not talking about something, right? So if you notice that could be one thing. Another thing is like if there were overt memories. So for some people, it's a caregiver found them stimulating themselves at a young age. Maybe they were like 3, 4, 5, 6, and it was like a self-soothing type behavior, but the caregiver, had a pretty big reaction and told them that was wrong, right? They might have developed some kind of shame around that behavior. And that can also like extend into, like elementary and middle school years as well. More so than like when it's more developmentally appropriate to like be exploring one's body. But at that stage, it's super common for people to be, just kind of curious about their bodies and also really engage in things that are self-soothing, like sucking a thumb or like holding a teddy bear or something like that.
Yeah.
So
like let's
right.
follow that scenario. So if there's someone who was scolded for exploring their sexuality at a young age, and then they're trying to experience a sexual experience in their adult years, how might that impact their ability to experience pleasure there?
Yeah. So with the example of like a young child, and let's say they felt like they were scolded, so then they didn't engage in that. But then let's say that resurfaced when they were a teenager. They might feel a sense of anxiety when they are self-pleasuring because that was something that was frowned upon or wrong. And even though it developmentally is appropriate for them to be exploring their body at that stage in a sexual way, whereas earlier it was more from a self-soothing perspective, that shame could carry with them into their adulthood, where maybe they feel uncomfortable touching their bodies when they're, as an adult or with their partner. That could keep them from feeling like they have an understanding about what feels good in their bodies. It could also make it hard. I think with the other example of like, we don't talk about sex, sometimes people enter relationships as adults and don't feel like they have a great understanding of how to bring up their sexual interests or talk about what kind of feedback, like, present feedback of what feels good, what doesn't, have any kind of communication skills around like developing intimacy. So sometimes I think both those scenarios can kind of lead to challenges in intimate relationships, if not corrected or like addressed. Properly.
And that's so sad when you see people who aren't able to feel confident about if they feel shame around their bodies or sexuality or feel like it's wrong. And I know growing up religious, I grew up in the Catholic Church. I definitely experienced a lot of like sex is bad, homosexuality is bad. So there was always this like level of guilt or even wanting to talk about it for sure.
Yeah.
So when you get these clients into your office, like what are some ways that you take them through overcoming this performance anxiety?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, like we want to talk about where it came from. Is that something they've always experienced? Is that something that kind of started more recently? And in what situations does it occur? Majority of people that I work with experience performance anxiety when they're with a partner, and they typically don't when they're on their own. And a lot of that can stem from relational issues. It can also stem from um, fear around like kind of lack of experience or confidence with a partner. Or if they have like a memory or an experience of something not going well and we're experiencing quite a bit of stress at the time, sometimes that can also exacerbate things. So to get a little bit more specific, like let's say somebody, was feeling really aroused and then one day they like lost their erection and their partner had like a really big reaction and said something kind of critical to them. Even if it felt like subtly critical and not super overt, that person might feel a sense of shame or anxiety, and it could be possible that they would develop performance anxiety after that point. Going carrying into other interactions, let's say that relationship ends or that encounter ends, they might feel nervous continuing in other relationships. So that's an example of how like a partner's reaction can make a big difference. Sometimes it can be more internal. So it's that individual, they're dealing with a lot of stress and they feel like the sense of like, I have to get this right. And when we know that we're experiencing a lot of stress, our bodies don't tend to access pleasure in the same way. We are tending to stressful or threatening thoughts as opposed to things that would be pleasurable or exciting or relaxing. And so sometimes that is a time when people will notice challenges with their performance anxiety as well.
Yeah, yeah. So it sounds like really understanding where that comes from, either if it's from your childhood, your adolescent
Mm-hmm.
years, or even just with a sexual partner as you've gotten older,
Mm-hmm.
those events really impact your ability to show up confidently in sex.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything that like I think really like rocks your confidence like in what you've already known, I think can be like a big like it could be a big event or a small event, right? So we're talking about like let's say outside stress coming in, we're talking about a relational interaction. It could also be a medical event, right? So if someone's going through any kind of let's say like cancer treatment or they have chronic pain or maybe they have like some big changes because they're going through like perimenopause or andropause, like some of these hormonal things can also play a role too. And so it's not like that uncommon for somebody to feel like, okay, my arousal used to be here and these things used to get me where I wanted to go. And now I feel like things have changed and I don't really know what to do here. It's like not working the same way that it used to. And so evolving sexually, I think can be a challenge point for some people too.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Definitely evolving through different challenges like that is important. So if someone is experiencing like a medical issue
Yeah.
or a hormonal phase that's impacting
Mhm.
their ability to experience that pleasure, what do you advise them to do in those situations?
Yeah. So first, like we're getting clear on like what is sort of the point, like what is working and what is not, right? So if it's like shifting positions is often a time where people will like lose stimulation. For some other people, it's if a partner stops like stimulating for any period of time. So I'm thinking more so like if people with vulvas, if it's like if there's like a break in consistency, a lot of people will report like that can really like impact their arousal. And then they might be more aware of like, oh, am I going to be able to get this back? Or like, is this taking too long or something like that?
Yeah.
Um, and then for people with penises, like that's kind of the shifting positions kind of can cause challenges too with like lack of stimulation. As far as like the illness thing, I think we have to figure out or the medical event, what exactly is the like way that this is showing up? an arousal based thing? Is it, do we need to talk about other medications to try with your physician and get them on, on board and connected? Is it like a mechanics thing? Like we need to get you some wedge pillows and really set up your bedroom or your sexy space in a way that's going to be more accessible for you. Do we need to try some toys or devices to kind of help add more stimulation because you're needing that? Or do you need to add some more lubricant that we haven't really, been using this in the same way? So there's a lot of different angles to that. And this is such a therapist answer, but like it does depend, right, on like what it is that is coming up for the person.
Yeah, but I mean, I think what your approach is, you're really looking at all areas here, right? You're addressing what is the root of the medical issue. Let's get clear on that. What's the medication that we need to address? Maybe there's like nutrition things or physical things they need to address for their health. But then also in the bedroom, which is very practical, like a wedge pillow, like maybe it's just the position that we're in or the technique that we're using that is really hurting our ability to experience that pleasure. So
yeah, absolutely. I firmly believe that taking a comprehensive approach to sexuality care is the most important thing. I find it works really well in my practice, and we really work integratively with other providers. And that part of that means that like, a lot of people do have PTs that are going to urologists, OB-GYNs, things like that. And so making sure everybody is on board, the outcomes are just way better. So that's my bias, but it's also something I've noticed in terms of the care we provide too.
Yeah. And I mean, and so outside of the medical challenges that people might experience, going back to just general performance anxiety, you mentioned starting to really understand where the problem comes from. Then once they understand that, what can they do then to start shifting that anxiety?
So when there's usually like thoughts that are creating thought loops that are creating more anxiety. So we'll do some like cognitive behavioral work. So identifying like, okay, if you're worried about losing your arousal or a change in arousal, then can we build up some confidence and some ways to regain it should it get lost, right? So you can practice some reassurance. Some of it also might be redirecting your thoughts, right? If you're monitoring and you're constantly thinking about your performance like leading up to sex, you're already priming yourself to think about something scary or threatening or uncomfortable before you get started. And that just doesn't leave your body in a place where like it's going to make it harder to feel engaged sexually. So one thing we might work on are some mindfulness skills. So helping people kind of get into their bodies and noticing sensations without judging them. So there are exercises I have people do at home when they're doing daily activities like brushing their teeth or showering or making their coffee. And just to kind of get them into the rhythm of practicing mindfulness, because a lot of people just think it's like, I'm going to tell them to sit and meditate and sit in silence. And like, that's not what this is about. Getting into your bodies and like noticing physical sensations, slowing things down is one of the most evidence-based techniques for dealing with performance anxiety.
I'm so glad that you focus on that. That's a huge thing, especially in my practice, is getting people into their bodies and helping them feel things sensationally, their emotions. And I don't know, is it just a common thing in the queer community that we don't want to be in our bodies? Is that something that you've noticed, or is that just
yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people will find escapes from their bodies and like the things that we do. And like part of it could be like the modern world we're living in, right? Like we're so tech driven, right? If I'm having a conversation with you right now and I'm like, oh, my shoulders are really tight, like I'm not going to stop our podcast and be like, hey, my shoulders are really tight. Like, I'm going to keep going because I've been conditioned to continue the conversation, deal with my shoulders secondary, right? So I think that is something that sort of impacts all of us in like the modern digital world that we live in, that maybe it's caused us to reprioritize what our relationship to our bodies looks like.
Yeah, so a lot of Western conditioning for sure, and not prioritizing our comfort.
I went a little meta there. I hope that's okay.
That's okay. No, I mean that's what this is about. It's so mindfulness, getting into your body, definitely that's helpful. I had this experience once where I was struggling to top for a while, and so this was mostly during hookups, one-off hookups. I just could not stay hard.
Mhm.
And I started exploring a little deeper what was going on there, and just recognizing that as much as I was enjoying my hoe phase at the time, it's not really what I was wanting anymore. It was not as fulfilling to me as it was. And so when I started shifting that and getting into more serious dating and relationships, that was able to shift for me, where I used to have to take the HIM pills, the performance enhancers. So I would take those and that would help, but I stopped needing them once I got into a relationship. And so how do you help your clients really tap into that deeper sense of self to really get into alignment with what it is that they want?
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought this up because I think a lot of times this impacts like people's attachment and like the security they feel or don't feel in different situations. I've known some people who they don't experience any performance anxiety with casual hookups because they feel like they don't really have much attachment to the individual. It's a short encounter and that doesn't put as much pressure on the experience, right? So if it doesn't go super well, or if they feel like this person, doesn't like how they are experiencing them in a sexual way, like it takes the edge off in a way. They don't feel like attached. And then I've heard other people who really feel a lot more sense of security and safety when they have feelings for somebody, or they know that this person cares about them and they have a relationship. And so they feel way more at ease in those situations than, with partners who are more casual. So I've seen it kind of show up both ways. And I think it's really interesting. And the therapist in me likes to think about like, okay, what is someone's attachment history and how does that impact this? But that's a whole nother talk for another day.
I was going to say, do you want to get into any of that about that attachment?
I mean, we could go down that rabbit hole, but it sort of like taps into what do you feel, in what context do you feel more safe and relaxed?
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I definitely have had conversations with people who do feel more comfortable
Mhm.
in a hookup setting where there's no attachment to that person. They're just like, oh yeah, this is great. This is where I feel comfortable. And then as soon as that they get into a relationship or start developing feelings, then boom, that security goes off.
Right.
Right.
The other script I hear a lot is in college environments, a lot of people are having a lot of hookup culture and engaging in that. And so these casual encounters are much more commonplace. And historically, I've also noticed people engage in that while they're inebriated. So for somebody who's having sex where they're not fully sober, which is again has other kind of implications around consent and awareness and things like that. But if you're not fully sober and you're having these like kind of casual encounters, it does sort of then you enter into a relationship where there's like a lot more sober sex and a lot more like connection, a lot more at stake. Sometimes those people do like have a lot more performance anxiety because there's so much at stake and there's like way more pressure to feel like they could let their partner down. So it's also a vulnerability thing too of like, oof, I don't want to screw up here. I don't want to mess this up. This is like the love of my life or the person I'm going to spend the rest of my days with, or the person of the season and I'm really into them, like whatever it may be. And so I think that this, again, it shows up differently based on like where people are at. And I think attachment and vulnerability could have something to do with that.
Yeah. Which is, it's kind of a cute thought when someone's like, I care so much about this person that I want to make sure that they're feeling good. I do it the right way. But at the end of the day, if you're overthinking it, and I think it's just going to impact the whole experience really in a
Totally.
not so great way. So
Yeah.
I'd love to get into maybe some scenarios with you. So what are
Yeah.
some common scenarios of performance anxiety that you
Mhm.
see come up?
Yeah. So one you actually just mentioned, which is that if somebody is experiencing a lot of monitoring of themselves, right? There's a lot of performance anxiety and they're worried about their body. They might feel a sense of distress of having any attention on them. So what they might choose to do is focus a ton on their partner's experience. So this could be like, a person focusing entirely on like, giving their partner oral sex all the time, or like wanting to just like ravish them, but like really minimizing their own experience in the mix. So that's like one way that could show up. And again, it's really more of like, I think about it too with folks who've got like social anxiety, or if you're somebody who hates attention, right? It's like, oh, I don't want the spotlight on me. I'm going to put it on you so I can
Mhm.
avoid being seen in this scenario. So that's one
Yeah.
thing that,
So let's start with that one. So in
yeah.
that situation where that person doesn't want that attention on
Mhm.
them, they're focused on their partner, what would you say is the negative impact there?
Well, I mean, I think it ultimately, like, they're not getting their pleasure needs met. Their partner's probably going to notice at some point that, like, well, why aren't you having, a good time, or why does this feel imbalanced? Um, it's one of those strategies that's like, it's not super sustainable. So it might work for like some time, but it's likely that it could feel like imbalanced or disconnected, because this person's just kind of like showing up only for their partner. And it's a nice thing to do to care about your partner's pleasure, but also you're responsible for your own, and we're neglecting that. And at some point, that's probably going to come up. Otherwise, you're just going to have sex for your partner the whole time. And if that's
Mhm.
if that's what you decide, you both decide works for you, okay. But I haven't found as many people who are happy with that dynamic.
Yeah. And then, so what does it look like for someone to overcome
Mhm.
that fear of being seen or receiving pleasure?
So, I mean, first we are getting clear and like talking about this with their partner, right? Like this could be, you know, I've been avoiding being honest with you about this, or, this, I have a lot of shame around this, and it feels really hard for me if I like lose an erection, or if I lose like, my stimulation, and I kind of get stuck in, and I feel like I'm getting close to orgasm, but I don't, or I, one of those situations. So it's like talking about it, opening up, and creating more safety in the relationship to do so. Sometimes there is a good degree of that, and sometimes there's not, and it's more, needs to be built up over time. And then it's, doing some of those like mindfulness exercises with partners. So there are some touch-based exercises that can be helpful to really, see if that individual can focus on their own sensations, while also, having opportunities to focus on their
Mhm.
partners without it being like a imbalance in a significant way.
Yeah. And is there an example of maybe a question or conversation that could be had to help that connection?
Yeah. I really like people talking about what pleasure looks like for them in their bodies. So when I might ask them like, hey, if you're experiencing something that feels really good, what would your body look like? Can you tell your partner what that would look like, so that they can be aware of that?
Mhm.
Right. And then having them hold space for that and doing the same, and also talking about like, okay, if I'm feeling really disengaged, how is my body going to show up? What am I going? Am I going to be like closing my eyes? Am I gonna be looking away? Am I going to be, shrugging my shoulders? Like, all these like nonverbal cues are often really present during these moments. So helping people build their own awareness of how they're showing up, and like starting that conversation, I think can be helpful.
I love that. Yeah. And so what's a second scenario that
Mhm.
you see commonly?
So the other one that I see commonly is if somebody is really avoidant of sex. So let's say, partner is really worried about them, again, like their arousal or their functioning in some way. Their partner's initiating sex. They might be like really avoidant and not, often being declining, like trying to get away from their partner, or just like avoid situations where they could be even physically close at all. So sometimes I
So they just
see
don't want to have sex.
they don't want to have sex, because not necessarily because sex doesn't feel so good, but because of the anxiety that comes along with it.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't want to feel this intense pressure. So I'm not going to put myself in a situation where I could even have that happen. So, I mean, some people go as far as like, I'm not going to touch my partner. I'm not going to kiss my partner. I'm not going to be close to them because I don't want anything to lead to that point. For other people, it's like, I'm not going to show up, you know, I'm going to try to like avoid them and pour myself into work, or I'm going to like leave the house. Like sometimes it's just more of slight avoidance of like, okay, I'm just not going to bring this up. I'm not going to talk about it. And
Yeah.
hopefully we just don't have to brush this subject up for
So I
several
imagine a
months.
scenario like that, though,
Mhm.
it's probably not the person who's avoiding who's bringing the situation up and trying to address it. It's probably more so the partner who's like, hey, we're not having sex. What's going on here? can we go to therapy or something to talk about it? Am I wrong in that?
No. Typically, that is kind of what happens. It's, if somebody is incredibly avoidant and they're not bringing it up, it could also be that maybe they have like some conflict avoidance stuff too, where like bringing it up and talking about it feels stressful, which suggests to me that by the time they typically are reaching out to me, it's like they've tried a number of things and they're having a harder time communicating around this and figuring out some skills. So yes, typically it is like the partner being like, hey, what's going on here? And then, some kind of acknowledgement of, okay, like we need a different solution because this isn't working and we both want to have a better sexual relationship, especially if this isn't people's like starting off this way. So I work with a lot of people in longer term relationships too. And most people don't start off in like this kind of distanced relationship with sex, like where one person is really avoidant and the other person is pursuing it. That is, for some people, that's their dynamic, but a lot of times it's something that accumulates in time.
Yeah. Well, because I've been that partner. I've been the partner that doesn't
Yeah.
want to engage in sex. And
Yeah.
then anytime my partner would bring it up, I would be like, "Ugh, I don't want to do that. And like, ultimately there was some underlying resentment that needed to be addressed.
Sure.
But that's another story. But I'm curious, in those situations, how would you advise someone to approach that subject with their partner if their partner is avoiding it?
Well, I think the most important thing is being really calm and curious and trying to be understanding. I think it's very hard as human beings to both be listening and compassionate to someone when we also have very strong feelings about this dynamic that's impacting us. So that's, I think, the hardest thing, but it is important that, if a partner is experiencing a lot of anxiety, one of the best things you can do, I think, is to be able to say like, hey, I'd love to talk about this with you. Like, is now a good time? And to just be open, like non-judgmental about it. Like, hey, I really want to see like what can help here. Like, can you tell me like what's going on for you? And just trying to listen and be supportive, and also offering reassurance, right? So a lot of times people are worried like my partner's going to leave me, or they're going to be like hanging this over my head, or this is going to, they're holding their family back from starting a family if that's part of your plans, or they're worried that they're going to seek gratification elsewhere, right? And so there's like a lot of ways that this can show up and rear its head in like very scary ways, I think. And I think providing that reassurance can be helpful. One of the more damaging things people can do is to be like pretty critical. Why is this happening to you? What's wrong with you? This is so different from how my other partners are. But like anything that's like mean or critical, even if you think you're just asking questions in like a pointed way, like sometimes like just tone of voice and how that lands can really make it scary for the person on the other end. And, especially for the people who are socialized in the masculine, another thing we know is that they're often not, they're taught not to talk about emotions. And this is a pretty vulnerable topic. It's often not something people talk about with their friends. So it creates a lot of shame around it.
Yeah. And so there's three things that you said that I think are really important is the calmness in which you approach the situation, the non-judgment that you have around the situation. And there's a third thing. It'll come back to me, I'm sure. But yeah, because I imagine if you approach that subject, though, you can get really defensive. And so why would you encourage someone to be open to those kinds of conversations?
Well, I think if it's not addressed, it can create a pretty big wedge that people don't talk about, or it can create a wedge that feels like a point of distance. And, resentment builds, relationships, like the intimacy can erode. Sex is not the most important thing to everyone in a relationship, but usually some kind of physical connection, if that is something that was important and decreases substantially or changes dramatically without, really, I would say, intentional conversations and care around it, I think that can cause often like a pretty big wedge and dissatisfaction in the relationship. And so it's something that like, you want to be proactive about these kinds of things. If you let them, go and you don't attend to them, well, you're probably going to have a much harder mountain to climb when it comes time to dealing with it down the road. So, I mean, it's kind of like a choose your battle sort of thing, but I am always the one who's going to say err on the side of proactivity because things are easier to address when it's more imminent.
Absolutely. And I think it just creates a little bit more honesty in a relationship, more openness there
Yeah.
versus the restriction and resentment and just like trying to hold things in to keep the peace. So, what does the journey then look like for someone to overcome this avoidant type of performance anxiety?
Mm-hmm. I think recognizing that the avoidance only works for so long, right? And learning how to approach this. Sometimes it's relationship therapy, so inviting their partner in so that they can improve their communication. Other times it's identifying what they need in response to their partner. So do they need to have, feel like their partner is going to hear them, feel like their partner is going to, be that non-judgmental and calm and not have a big reaction? Do they need that sort of reassurance? Can they articulate those things to a partner? And then, recognizing that, like, what are some things that feel more accessible for them that don't have the pressure alongside it. So for a lot of people I work with, even I know we've been talking a lot about people with penises, but for people with vulvas, like there's a whole lot of anxiety people can have around like having sex that isn't going to feel good or feeling worried about the amount of time it takes for them to experience kind of adequate arousal and things like that. And so performance anxiety can definitely manifest that way too. And so another thing we work on is non-demand kind of touch. So having an intimate experience that doesn't involve the thing that's scary. So if the thing that's scary is penetrative sex, then we're taking that off the table. If the thing that's scary is oral sex, then we're taking that off the table. It's starting small with these like other ways that they can be close and intimate and focus on the sensations in their body without it escalating to something further.
And you call that non-demand touch?
Mm-hmm. That's the clinical term. I usually call it something way more fun with clients, like we're going to try touching time or sexy date or pleasure date or something like that.
I like that. But okay. But so it's really taking whether it's penetration or oral, taking that expectation out so that they can just experience subtle forms of touch and then build up their tolerance to that if they want to. Is that right?
Yeah. So it's taking the pressure off that like a certain outcome doesn't have to happen. And if there's a degree of perfectionism around this, that some of my clients who do experience this do tend to have more perfectionistic tendencies, then we're also looking at like, how do we focus on like imperfect sex or having like good enough sex, or thinking about how do we think about pleasure versus like performance and having to check a box, right? So some of that's also part of the non-demand experience is like, I get to show up, I get to caress my partner and feel good about that without having to worry about something else that's coming next, which often is how the past encounter has played out, and that created more anxiety. So we're sort of restarting, like redeveloping their relationship to physical touch in a way that doesn't have that same kind of anxiety attached to it.
Yeah. Because I imagine what happens is that a lot of them are afraid to say no more because they're afraid of rejecting their partner or making their partner feel rejected in that way. So taking that expectation out, I imagine, just creates a lot more safety for them because the no is kind of set up ahead of time. It's like, here's what I am comfortable with and here's what I'm not. Now we can enter this space.
Yeah, for sure. And we do a lot of talking about initiation to it, or like I call it invitations. Like, I'm going to invite you to be sexual with me, declining, accepting. I always tell people, I'm like, if you can come to therapy and one day you can tell me that you can accept and decline invitations, mutually, and it not creates distress in your relationship anymore, like, I think my job is done. Because like, that's like, we want to have tolerance to be able to have both of those outcomes play out and it not feel like a big distressing event, which often happens when there's like points of disconnection.
And at the same time too, I think it's probably important for people to hear the word no and to not, throw a fit or act a certain type of way that might intimidate their partner from saying no again.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. I mean, so often, there's so many reasons why people have sex and don't have sex. When I teach classes, at the very beginning of class, like the very first week, I ask people, I'm like, okay, let's put on the board, what are some reasons people have sex? And there's like 100 reasons on there. Not all of them are like great value congruent reasons, but like
Yeah. I
they're
was
all
bored.
right. Or like to please my partner, right? Like not all of them are going to make us feel warm and fuzzy inside, but like there are a lot of reasons. Well, and there are a lot of reasons why someone wouldn't want to be sexual. And just recognizing that and having tolerance for that is important because, I don't know how many people who are actively having food poisoning that are going to want to, have a romp.
Oh my gosh. I hope no one's asking their partner with food poisoning
I just like to give a
to
big
have a romp.
example there to like highlight that, there are times when it's not really advisable or often, desirable to do that. So
Yeah. Oh, I wouldn't put it past some people, but let's hope the majority of you are not out there asking your sick partners for sex. Um,
yeah.
So, um, the last question I have around this is really around expectation, this topic of expectation. I imagine you get this a lot around the expectation of finishing or having an
Mm.
orgasm of some sort. So, what are some things that you do with your clients to really take away that pressure from
Mm.
having that wonderful orgasm at the end?
Yeah. So we work on a lot of focusing on pleasurable sensations and how like breaking down all the different areas they're experiencing pleasure throughout sexual experiences that are not focused on orgasm because there are a lot of different sensory areas we have all over our bodies. And a lot of times people focus specifically on the orgasm. Like if I didn't have the orgasm, then nothing else matters. It's sort of like really damaging to the way that we're thinking about this, when in reality, there's often a lot of things that happen during sex that feel good. And we need to recognize and appreciate those. So we're kind of dismantling the pedestal or the pedestalization of putting the orgasm up there and sort of saying, okay, has to be what happens, because that creates another like checkbox thing, another evaluative experience people are going to have of, well, if I had an orgasm, I'm good. And if I didn't, it's bad. And that creates a lot of splitting, right? Like this is good or this is bad. That's sort of all or nothing kind of thinking, which just creates more anxiety. So we're trying to really focus more on pleasure, broadening their understanding about pleasure-oriented view of sex and trying to step back from this sort of performance view of orgasm has to be at the top here and I have to achieve that in order to have a good sexual experience.
Speaking of Western culture earlier, right, of like
Mhm.
this need to just ignore the present, there's these expectations you have. But I notice in the past, there's been times where I want to finish just so that I can show my partner, okay, we're done, or you did a good
Yeah.
job. And when I have been in space where I felt really safe and been really honest, a lot of times I don't have that experience. And it was pleasurable enough. I got that physical connection that was good for me. And I think when you can have that, it just creates so much more pleasure throughout the entire experience of it and
Mhm.
an even deeper sense of intimacy, right? Because it's not dependent on this show-stopping event, as you might say.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I love
Yeah.
that because I
Yeah.
think a lot of people put a lot of pressure on themselves and an orgasm. And then sometimes there might be days where, like, mentally, it feels really hard to focus, and orgasm just feels like maybe unattainable or just off the table for you. And if we're only measuring the success of our sexual experiences with whether or not we had an orgasm, there's so much to be lost, right? And I just think like that's a shame. And it's also not reflective of everyone's satisfaction. It's one component. Like I recently was doing some research and read a study, and it was like, what are the components of sexual satisfaction? And orgasm was something that people did include, but other things were like, was it erotic? Did they feel like a sense of aroused or connection with their partner? Did they feel like they were like doing something that like felt good, right? So like pleasure is far more indicative, more generally, of like, was this successful versus like, did I have an orgasm? So
Yeah.
I don't know. I
I
think
love
sometimes we
that.
got to demystify the orgasm
I
a little
think
bit.
so. I
Yeah.
think we would have already, but
Yeah.
So, this has been an amazing conversation. I think this will be really helpful for a lot of people. If you could leave the audience with one last piece of wisdom, what would
Mm.
that be?
no pressure, right?
Easy.
Easy.
Done.
I think that ultimately, we are allowed and we need to give ourselves the permission to recognize that our sexuality is going to evolve as we do in life. And a lot of us have been taught that, just like we were just talking about, that like sex ends when somebody has an orgasm, or both people do, or all people do. And it's like these messages are not, they're first of all, I did not, create this. You didn't create this. Why are we letting them dictate our lives? We need to be recognizing that as we evolve as human beings, our needs may evolve, and that's okay. And I think having permission for that is really, really important, because if we can accept that, then we can have, a lot more fulfillment and a lot more joy if we can work with what we've got and recognize that like not all changes are bad changes. They're just changes. So I think kind of holding space for this evolution of our sexual lives is important.
That's beautiful. Well said. Oftentimes when things change, we freak out and think it's the end of the world.
Right.
Rather than accepting that and working with those changes and who we are in the seasons of that change. So, thank you so much, Jennifer, for being our guest today. And I will talk to you soon.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Thank you for listening to the Queer Conscious Podcast, where we explore how love feeds us, heals us, and gives us life. I'm your host and queer love coach, Nathan Serrato. But remember that the conversations that we're having here today are not a replacement for working with a licensed therapist, professional coach, or mental health practitioner. These conversations are for entertainment and education purposes only. But if you are dealing with some big challenges and you're thinking about seeking some professional support, it is one of the most empowering things that you can do for yourself. You can visit queerconscious.com for more information on how to do that. Now, if you love today's episodes and you want more episodes like this, I need your help. Please leave a 5-star rating and review. That's going to help me to bring you more high quality content and interviews. So until then, take care of yourself and don't forget to let love in.